This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
We're in Genesis chapter 18, and we're taking a look at something that happens in Abraham's life that actually sets the stage for what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks. The next 2 weeks, we're going to look at angels. Obviously, it's Christmas time, and angels factor into the Christmas story. But I want us to take a look at angels. What angels are, who they are, do they exist, can we encounter angels today? And we'll take a look at what the Bible says about angels. But these angels show up and visit with Abraham. And we see some pretty interesting things, specifically this issue of probabilities versus possibilities in this story. In chapter 18, beginning with verse 1. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then go your way now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. Then he brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where's your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then the Lord said, notice that, then the Lord said, so one of these angels was the Lord. Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself, and she thought, "After I'm worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied, said, I didn't laugh. But he said, "Yeah, you did." Now, these 3 angels appeared to Abraham. One of them apparently is the Lord. Now, the story is curious because it re-emphasizes the doubt that existed, in this case, concerning it was Sarah's doubt, concerning God's promise. Now, Abraham had similar doubts also. But this is the first time that we see Sarah's response to it. Interestingly enough, by the way, Sarah, remember as you read the story, she was in a tent behind them as they were talking to Abraham. So when she went into the tent and started laughing or giggling about it, they wouldn't have actually audibly been able to hear her. But the Lord knew. He knew what was going on. One of the reasons that God's promises don't come into fruition or don't come to fruition is because we simply don't believe them. God gives us promises, but if we don't believe them, then how can you apply them? How can you make them happen in your life? And since we don't believe them, we couldn't possibly be ready to accept them and see them develop in our lives. If I don't believe that God said He's going to do something, then I'm not going to be looking for it. I'm not going to apply it in my life. If it has a requirement that I'm supposed to do something, I'm not going to do it because I don't believe the promise. And there are hundreds and hundreds of promises in the Bible. Promises that we can take and apply in our life. But if we don't believe them, they do us no good. And the reason we don't believe them is because we think in probabilities. We think, probably that's not going to happen. Probably that can't happen. The probabilities of this promise actually coming true in my life is very, very small. Maybe nil. But let's focus on an interesting statement that was made in this passage, in verse 10 specifically. Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now, I've named our study today God's Possibilities Because that's what God was trying to get Abraham to see. He wasn't talking about probabilities. He didn't say, you'll probably have a son. If things work out, I'm hoping you'll have a son in a year, Abraham. We're no probabilities. It was the possibility. He was getting him to see the possibility that he was actually going to be a father of a child with Sarah. Now remember, Sarah had been barren her whole life. She never had a child. And now she's 90 years old, past the age of childbearing, according to the Bible. And so there's a double whammy there. She's a cultural defect from that standpoint. Because in that culture, you were expected to be able to have children. Otherwise, you were dead weight. You were considered to be cursed or of no value as a woman. And so Sarah had grown up feeling that way, feeling that she was an outcast, feeling worthless, feeling useless. And not only that, remember, she had a husband who wasn't all that proud of her. He wouldn't defend her when they went to Egypt. Remember, he told her to tell everybody that he was her brother so that they wouldn't kill him. He wasn't so much worried about her, he was worried about his own hide. He didn't defend her. He just said, tell them we're brothers and sisters so that they'll, because she was apparently very beautiful. And he said, they'll want you for their wife, and they'll kill me if they think we're married and take you to be their wife. So just tell them that we're brother and sister, then they'll treat me nice. And so she had a husband who really didn't defend her. Now that was how she grew up. And now she's past the years of childbearing, and now she hears that she's going to have a child. This cultural defect is now going to have a child, and she's going, there's no way. There's just, the probabilities of that happening are just nil. She was thinking in probabilities. What are God's possibilities in your life? What are God's possibilities in your life now? When you look at your life and you say, what are God's possibilities? I'll bet you have a tough time thinking about that, because we tend to think from probabilities. What's probably going to happen in my life? What are the probabilities of what's going to happen in my life? And God's saying, what are the possibilities? When God looks at you, what kind of potential does He see in your life? I can guarantee you that God sees greater potential in your life than you do. Where does God want to take you? I guarantee you God has greater plans, bigger plans for you than you do. Just how big are God's plans for your life? His plans are a whole lot bigger because you're thinking in probabilities and God's thinking in possibilities. Now, let's look at some things that God cannot do. There's an awful lot of Sarah in us. But the fact of the matter is that even though we think in probabilities, God makes it very clear, for example, in Luke, for nothing is impossible with God. There are no impossibilities with God. There are no impossibilities with God. Well, then what can God not do? Well, first of all, God is not limited by your circumstances. God is not limited by your circumstances. You see, Sarah was too old to have children. And even though she was defining her circumstances by her probabilities, it was pretty clear that the reality of it was that she was past childbearing age. And when God says, you're going to have a child, she was looking at the probabilities, not at God. Now listen to what I'm about to say, because this is so important. We tend to define God by our circumstances. We look at our situation, we look at our life, we look at the circumstances in our life, and we say, well, this is my lot in life, and this is what God is, and these are the limits of what God's going to do in my life. We base our perspective of God on our circumstances, which is a foolish thing to do. Now let's look at Sarah's situation. If God isn't limited by your circumstances, then there was something major about to happen, because Sarah was too old to have children. I love what Luke 18:27 says. It's impossible for mankind. But whatever is impossible for mankind is possible with God. Another way of saying it is, what is not probable with man is possible with God. So Sarah was too old to have children. That was just, those are the circumstances. But that was not limiting to God. Another example is the Israelites. Remember when they left Egypt and they began the Exodus and they were backed up against the sea and the Egyptian army was coming for them. I love what Psalm 78 says. It kind of explains the whole thing in a nutshell. Let's take Psalm 78. Exodus 14 explains it this way. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-Hahiroth, near Baal-Zephon. They were right against the sea. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were Egyptians marching after them, and they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. Now, as you drop down a few verses, it explains what was going on. You drop down a few verses, and look what happens. Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, which was what God told him to do. And all that night, the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on the right and on the left. Cecil B. DeMille had nothing on God. And I know we're not going to have videotapes when we get to heaven because, maybe a DVD, I don't know. But when we get there, I really would like to see that. Wouldn't you? I want to walk through it. I want to walk through that experience because I want to see the fish, is what I want to see, Don't you know fish had to be coming swimming up going, what? That's amazing to me. And we look at that and we think, did that happen? And the Word of God says, yes, it happened. But in our perspective, which is the perspective of probabilities and circumstances, it never would have happened. Because we base our concept on the basis of probabilities. Now, if God can cause a 90-year-old woman who has never been able to have children to get pregnant, and He can open the sea as an escape route for the fleeing Hebrews, don't you think He can accomplish something like that today? Don't you think He can overcome the circumstances of your life to accomplish His plan? If God can do that for Sarah, and if He can do that for the Israelites, can't He take care of you? Aren't His possibilities great for you also? Of course they are. God is not limited by your circumstances. He's not looking at the situation in your life going, whoa, we got one here. What do we do now? God is not limited by your circumstances. Secondly, God is not limited by your unbelief. You say, okay, so God can overcome my circumstances, but what about if I don't believe it? It didn't matter that Sarah didn't or couldn't believe, did it? Sarah couldn't believe that she was going to get pregnant. She didn't believe it, but God said it would happen, and He didn't hesitate to even put it on the calendar. This time next year you will have a son. That meant within the next 3 months that she was going to get pregnant. God put it on the calendar. He was not limited by her unbelief. Now note that God may choose not to respond because of one's lack of faith, but He's not limited by it. I love what happens in Matthew chapter 13. Look at this story. Matthew chapter 13, beginning with verse 54. Jesus comes into His hometown, and it says, starting with verse 54, coming into His hometown, He began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked. So they knew He had this incredible wisdom and miraculous powers. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at Him. But Jesus said to him, only in his hometown and in his own house is a prophet without honor. And He did not do many miracles. He did some. But He did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. He wasn't limited by their lack of faith. He just chose not to respond. God is not limited by your unbelief. But I want you to see this amazing truth. It's taught in Romans. Romans chapter 3, verse 3 says, what if some did not have faith? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? And verse 4, the beginning of verse 4 starts with, not at all. God is not limited by your unbelief. He knows you think in probabilities. He understands that. But He wants you to start thinking the way He thinks. He wants you to start looking at possibilities. So God is not limited by your, He's not limited by your circumstances. He's not limited by your unbelief. And He is not limited by your, or by the requirements. He's not limited by, well, this has to happen. These are the requirements. Again, note that by man's requirements, Sarah needed to be younger to be pregnant. I mean, the requirements, physical requirements, were such that she should have been younger. She was past childbearing age. Even Abraham wondered if he wasn't too old to father a child with Sarah. Back in chapter 17, where we were last week, Abraham, verse 17, chapter 17, verse 17 says, Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? I mean, he looked at the physiology of it and said, no way, it can't happen. What kind of requirements do your needs demand? What kind of requirements do your needs have? God is not limited by those requirements. Psalm 78 talks about some of the incidents in the desert. We were talking about when they crossed the desert, and there were a number of other things that happened in the desert when the Israelites were during the Exodus, and when they were on their way to the Promised Land. And there were a number of things that happened. For one thing, they were out of water. They ran out of water. Then there was no water in the desert, and water requires a source. And so there was no water. There was no source. There was a requirement. They were out of grain. You can't grow wheat in the desert. It requires crops and water and fertile soil. They were out of meat. You can't raise animals in the desert. It requires water and grain. It had all of these requirements that they couldn't meet. The requirements were too great. But those requirements didn't stop God. Psalm 78, verse 19, they spoke against God, saying, can God spread a table in the desert? When He struck the rock, water gushed out. I love the word, gushed out. It didn't trickle. It gushed. You know why it gushed? Because there were a bunch of them, and they all needed water. So it wasn't just a stream. They didn't hold a little Dixie cup. They were. It took a while for all of them to get water, so it had to gush out of a rock sitting in the middle of the desert. When He struck the rock, water gushed out and streams flowed abundantly. But can He also give us food? Can He supply meat for His people? They were whiners. Drop down to verse 22. For they did not believe in God or trust in His deliverance. Why? Because the requirements were too severe. Verse 23, yet He gave His command. He gave a command to the skies above and opened the doors of heavens. It rained. He rained down manna for the people to eat. And He gave them the grain of heaven. Now, if you can't grow grain in the desert, God says, not a problem. I'll give you grain from heaven. God's not limited by the requirements. Men ate the bread of angels. Those are basically Rice Krispie treats. He ate the bread of angels, and He sent them all the food they could eat. All the food they could eat. And then verse 27, 28, 29, He rained meat down on them like dust. Flying birds like sand on the seashore. Here they were out in the middle of the desert. They wanted meat. They needed the protein. And God said, okay, I'll send you some birds. You can have the birds. I'll just fly the meat in. He made them come down inside the camp. They didn't have to go hunting for them. They came down inside the camp, all around their tents. And they ate till they had more than enough, for He had given them what they craved. God is not limited by the requirements. You see, we think in probabilities and God thinks in possibilities.